The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And here's round one, which tests their vocabulary. 2 marks if they get the meaning of these words more or less right. Nancy Spain, beginning. What is a Walloon? W-A-L-L-L-N.
Well, somebody who has lived in what speaks Flemish. It's one of those countries, the Netherlands.
Which one?
Belgium.
Yes. I speak subject to correction, Nancy. I don't think they speak Flemish. They've got a dialect of their own, which is a form of French. They run right along that border, apparently, both on the French side and on the Belgian side. And it's either the people or the language, whichever you like. Walloons. 2 marks. Frank Muir, what is lockage? L-O-C-K-A-G-E.
Lockage.
Lockage.
Very good question. I compliment you, Jack. Lockage is the incidence of lockery on canals or any form of inland waterway.
That's right. It's the amount of rise or fall effected by canal locks. It also could be a toll that you pay for getting through a lock. No doubt you've done that in your time, Frank. And if you stole that, it would be the rape of the lockage, no doubt. 2 marks it is. Dilys Powell, what is a Kraken? K-R-A-K-E-N.
Kraken. It's not a very friendly creature. It's a kind of monster, I think. I think it lives in the sea.
Yes, it does. And about how big, Dilys?
Oh, very, very large.
Yes, all right. It's an enormous mythical sea monster which every now and then used to float to the surface of the sea off Norway, and people thought it was an island and built churches and houses and things on it, and it sank again. Rather nasty. 2 marks. Tennyson wrote about it, and so did John Wyndham. Denis Norden, what is Urticate? U-R-T-I-C-A-T-E. Urticate.
Urticate is to indicate by giving somebody a very painful nudge. Now, wait a minute, is it anything to do with urticaria?
Yes.
Urticaria. It's a rash. It's,
Yes, what kind of
skin
rash?
trouble.
Yes, it is a particular rash.
It is a particular rash, yeah.
I'm going to give you a half mark, Dennis, for it's to sting like a nettle. And what you were talking about, urticaria, I think is normally called nettle rash. Nancy Spain, what is trichosis? T-R-I-C-H-O-S-I-S. Trichosis.
It's something to do with the scalp.
Yes?
Well, I suppose.
Anosis of the scalp.
Yes.
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 That's it.
So there's something wrong with it.
Something wrong with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shifts.
Itch. Let's have it, Nancy.
Well, it's something wrong with your scalp.
Yes, any morbid condition or disease of the hair or scalp. 2 marks. Good enough. Hank Muir, what is otology?
Ology is the science or study of.
Yes.
Otology, the study of porridge.
Nope. It's the science or study of the diseases of the ear, or the anatomy
Dreadful
of the ear.
program, isn't it? Itches, twitching scalps, and ears falling off. Well, let's change the subject. Let's play whist.
Sort of ear, nose, and oat. Back to Dilys Powell. The meaning of the word Miff, M-I-F-F.
Make a mess of, make a muddle of.
I'm going to give half a mark for that, but not more, because apart from the slang use, it is a huff or a petty quarrel, or to pick a quarrel with somebody, or to take offence with them. And Denis Norden, what is a vedette? V-E-D-E-T-T-E.
Vedette?
Vedette? Vedette.
Vedette. Was a film star. That's right, yes. La grande vedette du film, Petula
Yes.
Clark. Yeah.
It was something, like most film stars, it was something else before it was a film star. Do you remember what that was?
Cement labourer,
Lorry driver.
lorry driver. I
Basmati.
studied English, but I gave it up.
I think I've got to give you your 2 marks, Dennis, because that is the common usage nowadays, at any rate in colloquial French, but it was before that a mounted sentry placed in advance of an outpost. And before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end of the programme I shall ask them where the quotations come from. And Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, "Put not your trust in princes." And Dilys Powell and Frank, yours is, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." And then at the end of the programme I asked Denis and Frank to give me their idea of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. Well, the second round is a round on what's the difference between. 2 marks if you get it right. Nancy Spain, the difference between ordnance and ordinance. One has an I in the middle and the other hasn't. Ordnance and ordinance.
Well, one is to do with guns,
Yes,
and that has not an I in the middle.
quite. And the other one, ordinance.
And somebody who has power to appoint the lords spiritual.
1.5, I think, is being a bit generous. Ordnance, without the I, is mounted guns or cannon or branch of public service dealing with guns and ammunition, Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and Ordnance Survey, because they carry out mapping as well. Ordinance is a decree or an authoritative direction. It could be a religious rite, and that's what you get your half mark for. Frank Muir, difference between pathos and bathos.
Pathos is the condition of sorrow and sadness.
Yes.
Bathos
Oh,
is
thank you.
from the sublime to the god blimey, isn't it?
All right, before we have any indelicate examples, I'll give you your 2 marks. Pathos, quality in speech or writing, which excites a genuine pity or sadness, and bathos, with the B, is falling from the sublime to the ridiculous, a wild anticlimax. Now, Dilys Powell, difference between antimony and antinomy. One has the M first, and the other has the N first.
Antinomy must be antinomy, nomos, law, something
Yes.
about the laws, yes. It's a kind of contradiction.
Yes, that's it.
Contradiction.
And the other one,
Ah,
antimony.
that's metal in a jar.
It's a metal in a jar. It's a
is it?
metallic substance, flaky, crystalline substance. The other one is a contradiction in a law or between one law and another. 2 marks, Dilys. Denis Norden, a llama and a llama with 2 L's, which I think is called Llama or Llama. L-A-M-A and double L-A-M-A.
Well, there's an hell of a difference. A llama with 1 L is a Tibetan monk or priest.
Yes.
And the one with 2 L's is what they've got in the children's zoo.
Yes. It's a South American ruminant, allied to the camel, but a great deal smaller, without a hump, and has woolly hair which you can use for spinning into stuffs. And Lama is a Tibetan or Mongolian Buddhist monk. Well, the next round is literary. I give each member of each team a quotation and ask them to complete it by giving the next line or lines. 2 marks if they complete it reasonably correctly, and 2 more for saying where it comes from. Nancy Spain, "'Tis sweet to hear the watchdog's honest bark bay deep-mouthed welcome as we draw near home."
Oh,
Isn't that great? It's a long narrative poem
That's it.
by somebody who writes in rhyming quatrains.
Yes.
Well, we only have 2 friends who write in rhyming quatrains.
Robert W. Service.
And Lord Byron.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there only are 2 poems that you ever have on this programme. And one is Don Juan.
All right, stick to that.
Oh, I
Well
was
done,
gonna-
Nancy, by process of elimination. It's Byron's Don Juan. Can you possibly complete it?
No, I cannot possibly complete it.
All right, you get 2 out of 4. "'Tis sweet to hear the watchdog's honest bark bay deep-mouthed welcome as we draw near home. 'Tis 'Tis sweet to know there is an eye will mark our coming and look brighter when we come. Don
Very
Juan
cool.
Byron. Pretty good. Frank Muir. Leave to Robert Browning, beggars, fleas, and vines. Leave to squeamish Ruskin, Popish Apennines.
Leave to somebody else entirely the two ensuing lines.
That's exactly what I want you to do.
Doesn't seem a sort of poem, actually.
Yeah.
Most poems don't mention other writers.
It isn't quite
Russell
fair.
doesn't whistle, is it?
No,
You would know, wouldn't you?
no. I don't think you're going to get it, Frank.
No, it's quite obvious from my face.
It's Charles Kingsley. It's in a poem which was written in a letter to Thomas Hughes. And it goes like this. Leave to Robert Browning, beggars, fleas, and vines. Leave to squeamish Ruskin, Popish Apennines. Dirty stones of Venice, and his gas lamp 7. Weave the stones of Snowdon, and the lamps of heaven. All right, on to Dilys Powell. Such men as he be never at heart's ease, whiles they behold a greater than themselves.
Sounds like Shakespeare.
Yes?
A historical play?
Yes?
A Julius Caesar play?
A Julius Caesar play it is, by Shakespeare. Now, can you go on and complete the quotation?
We're talking about Cassius, are we?
Yes, we are. Jolly good.
Talking about Cassius. We have it again. Let's sort of
Such men as he be never at heart's ease, whiles they behold a greater than themselves,
No, I don't think I'm going to get it, really.
and
with
therefore
plots.
are they very dangerous. I rather tell thee what is to be feared than what I fear, for always I am Caesar. It's the same one which he says, would he were fatter, but I fear him not. But it is Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, Caesar talking about Cassius.
Give me about me men that are
3
fat.
marks, I
Yes.
think,
Yeah.
would be fair. Now, Denis Norden. Herminius smote Mamilius through breastplate and through breast, and fast flowed out the purple blood over the purple vest.
Smashing bit of poetry, isn't it? Is it the Horatio keeping the bridge?
It's the same chap. It's the same. I mean, the same poet.
Same chat.
Chap. No, same
Chap.
Battle
poet.
of Lake Regulus.
Battle of what?
Lake Regulus.
Yes.
The Battle of Lake Regulus is my learning.
By?
By
Macaulay.
Macaulay.
Yes, quite right. Could you do a completion or not, Dennis?
Well, I couldn't do a word of it. Thank you.
All you have to do is to turn it inside out, and then you get it.
Turn the
Herminius
vest
smote
inside
Mamilius.
out.
Someone smoked somebody else.
Yes, that's it.
And purple ran with purple. And hopeless was the... Go on, Dennis. Anybody can write this.
I think. I don't think Dennis is going to get that. Two for Macaulay, Lays of Ancient Rome, Battle of Lake Regulus or Regulus, I don't know which it is. And it goes like this. Herminius smote Mamilius through breastplate and through breast, and fast flowed out the purple blood over the purple vest. Mamilius smote Herminius through headpiece and through head, and side by side these chiefs of pride together fell down dead. Sort of
Well,
Tweedledum and Tweedledee.
I didn't know that, and I'm glad. You hear glad.
All right.
Give Glad an easier one next week.
Well, the next round is much more serious, and it's characters from fiction. Total of 3 marks, if you can give me who the following characters were, in what work they appear, and what the writer was, which writer. Nancy Spain, John Ridd.
John Ridd.
Ridd, R-I-D-D.
Lorna Doone.
Yes,
Who
by?
had Mighty Thews.
Yes,
By R.D. Blackmore.
and he's the
He's the fellow with the Mighty Thews. The
Yeah.
the hero.
hero, that's what I wanted. 3 marks. Hero of Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Frank Muir, Mellows.
Oh, yes. Mellors, yes, he was the... Mellors was a chap that Lady Chatterley met in the wood, and she was a chap, she said, I'm game if you are. He was the gamekeeper
Yes,
in all sorts... Lady Chatterley's lover, in the book of the same name, by D.H. Lawrence.
3 marks. Gave
Want
me
to-
a dead
want
chap
a
to number by
quotation?
D.H. Lawrence. on quickly before he quotes. Dilys Powell. Jean Valjean. V-A-L-J-E-A-N. Jean Valjean.
Yes, that's a very old friend from the Miserables. His name is
Yes.
Nable.
By?
Victor Hugo.
And he was?
He had mighty thews too. He had a very long life. He began as a convict,
Yes.
and he escaped. Stop me if you've heard this one. Do you want me to go on, or shall
No, that's fine.
That's
I
enough.
was hoping you were going to say what he used the thews for. It's all nice to see
Well,
at the end of the
there was
book.
a moment when he lifted a farm cart.
That's
or
it. He lifted a
something.
farm cart near the end of
Is
the
this
book.
thews?
There was thews, yes.
Jean Valjean, hero of Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Denis Norden, Captain Ahab.
Well, he was the chap who was out to get Moby Dick.
Yes. And by?
By shooting him with a harpoon. Written by Melville, Herman Melville.
Yep. Leading character, apart from the whale himself, in Moby Dick by Herman Melville. 3 marks, well done. And now we come to the last round and go back to the quotations I gave to the two teams earlier on. The 2 marks, Nancy Spain, I'd like the origin of your quotation, and it was, "Put not your trust in princes."
It's in the Psalms,
Yes, you're quite right.
and somebody said it about Henry VIII. Thomas Cromwell. I
Thomas
think.
Cromwell quoted it.
Quoted
Yes,
it.
Psalm 146. And Dilys Powell, the origin of yours, which was, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water."
That's an epitaph. It's Keats, isn't it?
Yes,
Keats is it?
written by,
Himself.
yes, written by himself. And now I ask Denis and Frank to tell me their explanations of how these quotations came into being. And on this occasion, the marks will go to whichever unlikely story or explanation receives the larger amount of applause from you, the studio audience. So back to Denis Norden and his quotation, "Put not your trust in princes."
I'd like to refer you to another quotation. "Publish and be damned." It is a phrase that very nearly led to my downfall. I'll tell you how it came about. There's a time of life where you realize that some things that have never happened to you are not going to happen. I realized this last when I was looking through the honours list. Nothing. I looked through all the barons and the knights and the OBs and the MBs. Nothing. I didn't even get a book token as runner-up. And I got to think of all the other things that I had never achieved and never would achieve now. I'd never write a great novel. I'd never dance a paso doble. I was thinking about this, and suddenly I thought, why should these things go past me? Why shouldn't I make a resolution about one of them? Why shouldn't I learn one of these dances and really do it? And of course, the dance to learn now, you can't mess about, is the twist. I thought, why shouldn't I? But it's all the go. I could do. I know it's decadent and lascivious and all that, and it's the symbol of the decay of modern civilization. I can decay, as well. And so I set about it. You see, I bought this book called How to Dance the Twist. Now, I don't know if you ever tried to learn to dance a dance from a book. And it says things like, put the feet 6 inches apart, move them to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, moving only the feet, the knees, and the thighs and the hips, not moving the shoulders and moving the hands in the opposite direction. You try doing this all by yourself in a room with the rest of your family rattling the door handle and saying, "Are you going to be all day in there?" And I realized I'd got the physical movement. But I wasn't doing the twist. It didn't look right in the mirror, And I saw that the twist is more than just the physical movements. It's a state of mind. It's a complete sort of psychological disturbance. It's method dancing, see? And once I saw that, I was away. I could do it. the last, 8 weeks at the local palais, I've won 3 silver teaspoons and an embroidered coat hanger. That's not bad at my age. And I got this kind of flushed with success and triumph, and I thought, this is what's wrong with books that tell you how to dance. They just give you the physical movements. They don't give you the psychological background to the dance. So I wrote a book called Twist or Bust, and it showed the kind of psychodynamic motivation of the twist, you see. And if you read this, you were induced into the twist rather than just show the physical thing. And it would have been all right, except, you see, I got so carried away by this psychological thing that I went a bit wrong on the actual physical movements. I got a bit muddled up about the left foot and the right foot. So consequence was, of the people who bought it, 3 of them broke a leg, 2 of them sprained that ligament at the back of the knee, and 1 of them twisted his hip practically up as far as his armpit. And I've been sued for damages by all these people, and I'm still in the process of paying. So reverting to what I originally said, I would amend the statement, publish and be damned. I would say, yes, publish and be damned, but with one exception. Put not your twist in print, sirs.
I was led up the bathroom path there. I don't know whether you were. Now we go back to Frank Muir, and if you remember, his quotation was, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water."
I like people very much. I'm a great believer in people. Without people, if one walked into a deserted street, one couldn't say there aren't many people about, are there? Yes, I like people, but the one man I've met who really loved people was a man called Keats. I met him on a train. I was going up to Hull at the time because I was at a dance hall dancing a paso doble with a girl, which I danced rather well, actually. And I said, will I see you here next Saturday? And she said, I'll see you in Hull first. So I bought this ticket to Hull, you see. I was sitting in the dining car for lunch, and there I met Keats, this man Keats. He was this waiter in the dining car. He was small, and he had a sort of very thin neck, which stuck out of his rather frayed collar, like a vulture's neck. Huge boots he had, really enormous boots. Awfully nice man. And he eventually banged something down in front of me, breathing heavily, and he sort of champed, champed. He seemed to be, I suppose, about 82 or something. And he bent over me and banged something down, laid a plate full of stuff, and I looked at it and I said, is this the cod or the veal vol au vent? And we both peered at it rather miserably for a while. So he said, which did you order? So I said, the cod. So he said, it's the cod. Because I don't want you to go traipsing back to the cookery bit, because it's me feet. He said, you should see my toes. Like globe artichokes they are. And he took his boot off and rested it carefully against my roll and butter. He had no difficulty taking his boot off, because although it was a large boot, it was about a small foot. And there was a sort of inch clearance all around the foot. And he showed me his foot. It was his right foot. And he said, can I sit down, because I'll come over wobbly. So he sat down and he said, I'm not getting the food. I can't eat this muck. He uses his fingers in the kitchen there a lot, and it's horrible, and I can't eat it. And so I gave him a drink of water, and he said, I should retire, really, I'm a rotten waiter. So I said, why do you carry on with this? He said, I love people. It's the only way I can meet people is being a waiter. But I'm bad with my hands, I'm a clumsy man. I have been. For the 68 years I've been I should have been a brain worker. I'm the world's worst waiter, sir. But it's been a lovely life, a lovely life. And that's the last I ever saw of him. But about 2 months ago, I was staying in the country with some enemies. And it was a very long weekend. And I had my hay fever came back. And the only way I can stop my hay fever is going and sitting in a country churchyard. I got the doctor's called Gray's allergy. And I was sitting in the country churchyard, and the sexton came up and said, "Would you like to see Keats' tombstone while you're here?" So I said, "I'd love to." He took me over, and there was this simple marble slab, and chiselled in it were these words, and I'm sure they were Keats' own epitaph. It said, "Here lies Ron, whose name was Rotten Waiter."
Had the pathos at the end, because up to that moment it had been absolutely a voting story. But it seems to have won your vote, so I give my mark, your mark, to Frank Muir. And that leads us to a final score in which Nancy Spain and Denis Norden win by 1.5 marks from Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And here's round 1 to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they get the meaning of these words right. Nancy Spain, what is tarantism?
Tarantism. There's something to do with,
Tarantella?
no, I shouldn't think so. That's a dance or a spider.
Yes.
Dance?
Yes, you've got both in one, I think.
It's a dance or a spider.
Yes.
And you whirl round like a mad thing when you've been bitten by the spider.
Yes.
So the dance is called the tarantella.
Yes. You've danced your way to victory, I think. It is a dancing mania. Originally in southern Italy, the people who did it claimed that they'd been bitten by the spider, the tarantula spider, and there it was. Tarantella was the thing you danced to cure yourself of tarantism, but that's quite different. 2 marks. Frank Muir, what's an electroleer?
Not a sort of a man with a shocking smile. Is it an electrically lit up luster?
Yes. That's it.
Electrolia, what it was called. Yes, it's a candle bra lit by electricity.
Passing quickly over both of those points, we agree. It is an electric chandelier. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, what is a scarab? S-C-A-R-A-B.
It's a beetle.
Yes, what kind of beetle?
Well, it can be just a beetle, or it can be a beetle made of earthenware, or clay, or metal, which is sometimes found in Egyptian graves.
Yes, that's right. It's the sacred beetle of ancient Egypt, and it can be a gem engraved with various sort of hieroglyphs on it. Denis Norden, what is a flaneur? F-L-A-N-E-U-R.
With a thing over the A.
Yes, if you prefer it.
Yes. A marvellous word. Now, I took this in Matric, a book called The Crime of Sylvestre Bernard by Anatole France, and that was all about a flaneur, which is a stroller.
Yes.
A man who strolls along the left bank in Paris, looking at all the bookstores and so on, and doesn't do anything except stop and talk to the flower girls and what. And nowadays they say that it means a man who doesn't contribute to the national economic welfare and so on, but I don't hold with that. I think we're short of flaneurs, and we've got too many planeurs, and we should bring the flaneurs back.
Flaneur.
Oh, that's a brilliant description. 2 marks to Denis. Lounger or loiterer, idler, so on. There we are. Well, before we start this next round, round 2, I give each team a quotation, which they can write down if they want, and the 2 women members of the team will then, I hope, study their quotations, and at the end of the programme I ask them where the 2 things come from. Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, "She stoops to conquer," and Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, yours is, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." And then at the end of the programme I ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of their answers just yet. Well, the next round is a round of mythology. 2 marks if you get the answer right. Nancy Spain, who was Calliope, and in what way has her name now come into more general use?
Well, she was the muse of music, Jack, and she lived on the top of a rather uncomfortable mountain in Greece called Parnassus.
Yes.
And now she's mostly found in fairgrounds, whizzing round above all those lovely golden horses and things.
Yeah, you better define her a little more closely in her modern dress.
Oh, well, it's a steam organ.
Yes, it wasn't music, in fact, it was eloquence and epic or heroic poetry, but that's near enough.
I should have a lot of marks for that.
2. Well, this was especially in America, the steam organ that you had either on a, whatever thing's called, those steamers that go down the Mississippi, I can't remember, stern wheeler or something, and also in merry-go-rounds at circuses. Frank Muir, who was Actaeon, and what happened to him?
Actaeon?
A-C-T-A-E-O-N.
It was a misprint for Act 1. Yes. Yes. After a brief consultation with Dilys, he was torn to pieces by his own dogs.
Yes.
After he'd been...
Artemis set them on him.
Artemis?
Artemis.
Artemis set them on him. I mean, he was torn to pieces, Jack. To pieces by these dreadful dogs with jaws slaving. Oh! He fought. But no, the dogs were on him, torn to pieces. 4 marks.
But
Next
why-
question.
But why was Artemis or Diana so unkind to him?
He must have watched her bathing or something.
And then these dogs, slaving. Stag. There was he was turned into a stag,
That's
Jack,
right, yes. Now you've really got it.
ripped to pieces.
Yes, this graphic scene. We're not in Act 1 now, we're on about Act 5. I think.
And it comes from Greek mythology.
He was a hunter. He surprised the goddess, Diana or Artemis, who was bathing naked in a pool, and she disliked this so much that she turned him into a stag, and he was torn in pieces by his own hounds. Dilys Powell, who were the Valkyries, and what was the significance of their ride?
Well, now, the Valkyries belong to a different kind of mythology, much farther north and colder.
Yes?
And they were the kind of daughters, more or less, or anyhow favourites,
Yes.
with no hostile intention, favourites or daughters of Odin. And when a hero died, they all appeared and they put him on their cruppers
I think that needs some explanation.
And they took him to Valhalla.
Yes.
I think so too.
Yes, in that complicated and enchanting story, you've missed out one point. The point was they chose him in advance.
Really?
They decided who was going to die. These were the handmaidens of Odin, and they were the choosers of the slain. And that's in fact what the word Valkyries means. So they came rushing down into the battle on their horses, and they picked out the chaps who were going to die. And then, as Dilys quite rightly says, they took him up to heaven or Valhalla and waited on him there, and he drank his large drinks out of the skulls of his enemy. Denis Norden, what was or is a bacchante? B-A-C-C-H-A-N-T-E.
Well, there were the things that you see tearing around the top of Wedgwood vases with sort of laurel wreaths tilted over one ear and cups of wine and all looking very sort of happy birthday, sweet 16. You know. They used to hang around elderly Greek gentlemen.
And one in particular.
Mainly Bacchus.
Yes. Yes, I think that's...
And they were called waitresses.
All right, near enough, Dennis, for 2 marks. They were priestesses or votaries of Bacchus, and they loved wine and had dishevelled hair, just as Dennis suggests, and wore, I think it was an ivy wreath rather than a laurel one, over one ear, and clashed cymbals and were generally rather abandoned. Well, the next round is about origins and derivations, where expressions come from. And these are words and expressions which are very frequently used today. I want to know what they mean and also how they originated. Beginning with Nancy Spain. Nancy, what is a scapegoat and why?
Well, when something had gone desperately wrong with the tribe, herd, or society, you would pick on one unfortunate member of the tribe, herd, or society and drive it out.
Yes.
And it would stand with its head miserably sunk between its forelegs, waiting in the snow to be painted by Mr. Holman Hunt.
Yes, and nowadays...
Somebody takes the can back.
That's right, carries the can. The person who takes the blame, who may or may not be very well guiltless himself, and it comes from the book of Leviticus, the Day of Atonement, when 2 goats were taken by the high priest. One was killed and sacrificed. The other had the sins of the priest and the people transferred to him, and then was driven out into the wilderness. And there, as Nancy quite rightly says, the wretched goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities into a land not inhabited. Frank Muir, the phrase to go haywire.
To go berserk.
Yes, and why?
It means what it says, haywire. You see, hay used to be, Jack, used to be bundled together with twine. But the trouble was that it was all, you can never get long enough lengths, you know, never the twine shall meet. So they started using wire.
Yes.
And this wire had this peculiar quality because it had phosphorus in it. And it had an effect on their nervous system, and people went all sort of doolally when they were baling hay, and they traced it to the wire, so they said, he's gone haywire.
It's astonishing to relate, he's almost entirely right. It means now to run riot or behave in a thoroughly uncontrolled manner, but it does come from the coils of wire which used to be used, particularly in America, for binding bundles of hay. And if you got this coil of wire a bit awkwardly, or if it hadn't been properly sort of wound up, then it would spring out into great loops and get in your way and become tangled and unmanageable, so that he was as near right as well as you can think. 3 marks. Dilys Powell, to go scot-free.
Scot-free. You didn't have to go to Scotland.
No,
And you didn't have to pay Scot.
that's it. And Scot is
And
what?
Scot is, well, it's paying somebody's fine, or... To go scot-free is not to have to sort of pay anything.
Yes, that's all right. Go without punishment or without payment when you had expected you'd have to pay or have to be punished. It's an old English word for Scot is for payment or levy or tax. I mean, it's sort of rates or taxes. and you paid scot and lot, which meant you paid the tax which was assessed, and the lot was the bit of the tax which was appropriately yours to pay. I mean, it was your rate assessment, as it were. So that scot-free meant that you didn't have to pay the tax. Denis Norden, costermonger.
Costermonger is a chap who sells things off a barrow.
Yes.
Well, a monger is a seller, as
Yes.
in fishmonger. And it's people come up to his barrow and say, "What's the cost of this?" and "What's the cost?" Coster. He used to sell. What could he have sold? Costers. He
Yes.
sold costers, which was an ancient name for something for which the name has been changed.
1.5, Dennis, I think.
Well, I don't have to dot the I's on all these.
A barrow boy today, fruit, fish, etc. from a barrow. But originally it was a costard monger, which is a seller of apples. A costard was a very large apple, and that's what he used to sell at one stage, and was made easier to say than costard monger, became costermonger. Now we come to the last round and go back to the quotations I gave the two teams earlier on in the programme. 2 marks. Nancy, if you can give me the origin of your quotation, which isn't a very difficult one, I think. She stoops to conquer.
It's the name of a play by Oliver Goldsmith.
Yes. Dilys Powell, the origin of your quotation, which was, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever."
Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn.
No.
No?
Right
It
author,
is.
wrong poem.
Right or wrong? Thing of Beauty is a joy forever. Not Grecian Urn.
No.
No. Not Nightingale. Not Melancholy. There's only one more.
It's
Which
the
is
end of
the one?
Endymion.
Sure. No, it isn't. I'm going to give you 1 out of 2 because it's getting too easy, I think. It's the opening line of Endymion. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It can never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us." Nice, isn't it?
Lovely.
Opening lines of Endymion by Keats. Well, now I ask Denis and Frank to give me their explanations of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation receives the longer amount of applause from you, the studio audience. So back to Denis Norden, his quotation, "She stoops to conquer."
It was stock-taking day in the BBC sound effects department. I was working there at the time, some time ago when I first came to the BBC. I was working in the sound effects department as a junior storekeeper, which meant that my duties were roughly that if a radio producer had a radio play to produce, he would come to me and he would say, "For my play, I want a..." and and I would give him the appropriate gadgets to make these sounds, and then I would write out a docket which he would sign, which said, "Received one and now it may not sound much of a job to some of the more sophisticated, but it was necessary to have had a good schooling in order to be able to spell words like and that was all my duties consisted of finding the appropriate sound effects when asked for, signing them out to the people, and occasionally just feeding Betty. Betty is the BBC seagull who is used in all radio plays connected with the ocean or shipping and so on. Is actually the successor to Esther, who was the original seagull, who started with the BBC when the BBC started 30 years ago, and who I believe is now a governor. But there were 3 of us in the department: myself, my immediate senior, who was a man called George Stopes, and Mari, who was a girl we used in murder plays, whenever they wanted the sound of a body falling to the ground with a thud, we used to drop Mari. And the three of us were going through this department, listing, as I say, all the sound effects, or rather the gadgets for making the sound effects that we had in stock. And we came to the shelf marked simple monosyllabic sounds, which are rather sort of avant-garde sounds, like oink, doink, boink, and one which is only used in third program plays generally, which is gdoink, which is a sort of Brechtian sound when the wagon falls on Mother Courage's foot. They use this gdoink. And we'd come to this shelf, and the gdoink was there, the boink was there, the doink was there, but there was no oink. Well, now this was a terrible situation because we were the only ones who had the keys. Mari, George Stopes, and myself. If the oink was missing, it meant only one thing, that one of us had stolen the oinker. And then George Stopes broke. It's dreadful to see a man disintegrate. He said, "All right, don't look at me. I stole the oinker." And then the whole story came out. He had purloined the BBC oinker to sell it to a wealthy American oinker collector for the sum of 8 and 9, which he had spent then in riotous living. He flushed brick red, and we didn't know what to say, because we knew that a man who can make a confession like this, a BBC man, for him, well, after telling us there is only one course which honour dictates that he should take. Silently I went to the shelf marked sounds of pistol shots, and I took out a pistol shotter, and I handed it to George Stopes. He went behind the filing cabinet, and we heard the bang. Well, it's an ugly story, I don't pretend it isn't. There's no more left of it. We try to efface it from our memory. In fact, the only memory of it that is left is in the sound effects department still, where if you go in today for an oink, you will be led to this empty space on the shelf where the oinker was, and where there is now just a card, black-edged, which says, G. Stopes took oinker.
That's a truly wonderful glimpse of nightlife at the BBC. And we go on to Frank Muir, and if you remember, his quotation was, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever."
Well, as I was saying, there's this sort of jar thing in the middle of our mantelpiece. You see, and that's what made me say it. That's really all there is. Do you want to know about the jar? Well, it's in my lovely house in the poor quarter of Surrey. They have in the middle of the mantelpiece, there's this sort of metal jar thing. It's called a conversation piece. When you have guests, they say, "What on earth's that?" You see. And the reason it got there was because my wife, Mrs. Muir, said to me, "There's a bit of a hole in the centre of the mantelpiece," and this is before we had this metal object, and she said, I'd rather like you to get a Grecian urn, because my wife at that time was reading Keats. She has these terrible phases, you see, and everything's got to be under the Keats influence. And she said, "Would you go out and buy a Grecian urn which will sit there So I said, yeah, well, of course, yes, and she said, well, I think I'd better go because, you know what you're like, your mind drifts off to other things. I said, I'm perfectly capable, my dear girl, of going and buying a Grecian urn. Give me the money. So, so she gave me £3. I took the train up to Waterloo and I found myself in Soho. There's a sort of amusement arcade in Soho, so I had to go on the rifle range. And eventually I got really quite a pleasant vase. It wasn't Grecian. As a matter of fact, it was a vaguely vase-shaped, and it had a lot of seashells stuck all over it, forming the word mother. It wasn't very Keats, I felt, but definitely Shelley. So I was very careful about this and wrapped it and held it at arm's length. And it started to rain. So in case the rain should melt the glue which stuck the seashells forming the word mother on the vase, I thrust the vase under my raincoat and pushed my way rapidly out through the turnstile. The attendant was terribly nice and got a broom and helped me sweep up the pieces. Because the turnstile just coincided with the jar. And I now had about 17 shillings left, you see, my wife's £3, and still no vase. But I was walking moodily towards Waterloo, and I suddenly saw exactly the vase in the window of a private house. So I knocked on the door, and an awfully sweet lady came, and I said, I explained the whole position about how desperately I needed the vase. And she was quite kind. She had a sort of nip of brandy and then came back and talked to me. And she said, I said, well, could you sell it to me? And she was really, and I pressed 15 shillings into her hand, and she seemed delighted. I think she was the Daily Woman, actually. And so I took this vase, and I got the train back, and I was a bit early, so I went to the Red Lion, which is just near where I live, to have a quick one to celebrate this thing. And I was very careful. I put the vase on the counter, and nobody was around, nobody was near, and Mr. Blood, the publican, for that is indeed his name, poured me a drink. Now, he's got a dog, a very large Alsatian, and it's a curious sort of very nice animal, but a little curious. And it reared up, and it licked my very tall vase. And for one dreadful moment, the vase hovered, and I thought it was going to crash, but this is the truth. It isn't a story. And it did crash. It absolutely smashed to pieces. And though I was absolutely, with my train fare, I had 7p left, no vase. And a Keats-loving wife waiting for her vase. And suddenly, it was fate again playing it, just behind the sign on Mr. Blood's shelf which said, hot pies, sandwiches cut fresh to order. I saw an old pewter tankard with the handle off. I said, how much for that? And he said, 5 bob, do you? And I said, quoting from Shaw, not likely, Blood. And he said, how much then? And I said, 7p. And grabbing my pewter tankard with the handle off, I rushed into my wife and said, I've got it. And she said, well, where is this thing, which is absolutely wonderful and pure Keats? And I said, there. And there was this rather shabby, actually metal thing. She said, but that's not a Grecian vase. I said, Grecian vases are a very bad thing. Any vase made from China, I can tell you, it'll smash in a moment. Thing might last 10 years, it might last 2 minutes. But this, and I placed this awful little pot in the middle of our mantelpiece reverently, I said, this, well, in the words of Keats, a thing of pewter is ajar forever.
I think that's a dead heat, the amount that you gave in the way of applause to Denis and to Frank, so I'm going to share the marks between them. And that brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir win by 1.5 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir, and Denis Norden. And here's round one, which tries to test their vocabularies. 2 marks if they can give me the meaning of the following words. We begin with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is a victorine? V-I-C-T-O-R-I-N-E, victorine.
Victorine. I wear you.
Yes, you do.
A tippet.
Yes, what kind of tippet?
Fur?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know, I'm in fur.
That's good enough, I
Just
think, probably.
fur's enough.
Named after?
Victor.
No.
Ria.
Yes, yeah. Probably named after Queen Victoria. A woman's fur tippet. 2 marks. Well done. From about 1850. Denis Norden. The meaning of the word interlard. I-N-T-E-R-L-A-R-D. Interlard.
Inter means to bury. Lard is a cooking fat. To bury cooking fat. Now that's a custom that's dying out. Because it doesn't mean anything to do with that. You'd say, since appearing on My Word for the last 18 years, one interlards one's speech with literary references.
Yes. Meaning?
Well, you sort of sprinkle them into
That's it.
the speech as you apparently do. You sprinkle cooking fat? I don't know. I have a woman at home who does cooking for me and bears children and all that sort of thing. I don't know what you do with cooking fat, but presumably it's something to do with cooking the way you use it.
Fold it in, which I've never been able to understand.
That's right. You fold it into your speech.
That's it. You mix it up with. And as Dennis quite rightly says, it's people who try to sound more impressive than they have any right to by using big words or foreign words and mixing them up with what they're saying otherwise. 2 marks. Nancy Spain. What is a quant? Q-U-A-N-T.
It's a pole, Jack, that you push along the river, the boat with. Very tall pole.
Yes?
Frank Muir's great at it.
Well, how's it different from a punting pole?
Well, an ordinary punting pole has got a sort of little brass hook on the bottom.
That's it.
And
Yeah,
this
hasn't.
quant
It's
has
got something quite different.
quite
on the
else, like a
It's-
wheel-shaped bit at the bottom, as
That's quite right, because
pressing into the mud.
you're punting in East Anglia, which is a very muddy section of the country, and you need a wooden disc at the end of your punting pole,
Yes, you
otherwise
do,
it goes
Jack,
straight
yes.
into the mud and you go out of the boat. Frank Muir, what is tautology? T-A-U-T-O-L-O-G-Y, tautology.
It's a very literary word, this.
Yes?
And I myself personally think it's the use of more than one word to precisely to describe something where one word would do absolutely solely on its own.
Absolutely right. That's a beautiful example of a whole series of tautological statements by Frank Muir, and it does. It means needlessly repeating something which can be said in much fewer words. 2 marks it is. That's the end of the round 1. But before we start round 2, what I do is to give each team a quotation for them to write down. And I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end of the programme I shall ask them where those quotations come from. And now, Dilys, and Frank Muir listening, your quotation is, Britons never, never, never will be slaves And Nancy Spain, with Denis Norden, yours is your journey really necessary? And then at the end of the program, I asked Frank and Denis to give me their ideas of how these words came to be spoken or written, and I don't want any of these answers just yet. And so round 2. For 2 marks, of whom and by whom were the following words said. Dilys Powell. Though more than half the world was his, he died without a rood his own, and borrowed from his enemies 6 feet of ground to lie upon.
He's a very poor man.
Somebody who conquered half the world and died in exile.
Yes?
Yes.
Quite right.
Napoleon.
Yes, Napoleon. It was written of Napoleon. By whom?
Wait a minute now. It was written of Napoleon by somebody in English.
Yes?
Cooper.
No, it's later than that. I'm going to give you 1 out of 2. It was written of Napoleon by Thackeray in the Chronicles of the
Never read
Drum.
Thackeray.
What initial?
William Makepeace.
Never read Thackeray.
Denis Norden. I have not wasted my life trifling with literary fools in taverns as he did, when he should have been shaking England with the thunder of his spirit.
With literary fools in taverns.
Yes, or coffee bars, if you like.
Johnson, if it was
Yes.
coffee bars.
Yes?
And that was said by... Was it said by Shaw?
Said by Shaw, or...
Of Dr. Johnson in a coffee house.
That's quite right. G.B. Short in Parents and Children, talking about Sam Johnson. Nancy Spain, yours is much tougher. The coarse-bred son of a livery stable keeper. Apprentice to an apothecary.
Keats was...
Yes? Come on.
It said of Keats,
Yes, said of Keats.
by this man whose name we never can remember, who wrote this very nasty attack.
Now, you've got the chap right, and I don't think you're likely to get it. It's rather unexpected, this. That's why I said it was hard. I'm going to give it 1, Nancy.
That's very nice.
It's said about Keats by the poet Yeats in a poem called Ego Dominus Tuus. Now, Frank Muir. From his poetry, they drew a system of ethics compounded of misanthropy and voluptuousness, a system in which the 2 great commandments were to hate your neighbour and to love your neighbour's wife. He wrote about a Spaniard.
Is it Nancy's boyfriend?
Yes.
Lord Byron?
It's said about Lord Byron by...
By almost everybody at the time. It was literary tittle-tattle in the coffee houses, the period.
The chap I always get mixed up, quite wrongly, with Thackeray, if that's any help.
Would you get everybody mixed up with that?
Yes, you do. That's quite true, Dennis.
Longfellow.
No, I think 1 out of 2. It was said... Yes, you're quite... Oh, you've crept home in the last moment. It is. You're quite right. 2 marks. It was said of Lord Byron's work by Lord Macaulay in his literary essays. It was a review of Moore's Life of Lord Byron. Well, the next round is about verse and poetry. I give each member of each team a quotation and ask them to complete it, giving the next line or 2. 2 marks if they complete it reasonably well, and 2 more for saying where it comes from. Dilys Powell. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs.
Now, you tell me the bit I know. But in the balmy darkness, guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the fruit tree, and the thicket wild.
That's absolutely right, except you put the thicket and the fruit tree the wrong way around. But that's but who and
Keats.
What? Keats.
Ode to a Nightingale.
Quite right. Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, and 4 marks to Dilys Powell.
Well done, Gail.
There
Well done.
now.
Keep on like that.
Yes, it's all right.
Denis Norden. In his chamber, weak and dying, while the Norman Baron lay.
This is not Ode to a Nightingale.
No.
Half a mark? No.
No, not even La Belle Dame sans merci. No help.
It's doggerel.
Yes, pretty doggerel. In his chamber, weak and dying, while the Norman Baron lay.
Come and see the seagulls flying half a crown around the bay. Well, that's what it's that sort of poem.
It's that sort of poem, yes.
In his chambers, weak and dying, something the Norman Baron lay. Even though I'm madly trying, who wrote this I cannot say.
Have a shot at the author. I can't...
I would like to have a shot.
Well, you have in fact said it, you see. I was trying to help you.
Doggerel.
Who it was, I cannot say.
Seagull.
Anon.
Anon. All right.
It's written by Anon.
I'm going to give you rather, I think, generously, 2 marks for Anon. Nobody knows who wrote this. It's called A Strike Among the Poets, written in the 19th century. It goes like this. In his chamber, weak and dying, while the Norman baron lay, loud without, his men were crying, shorter hours and better pay. And Nancy, yours is this. The world is too much with us, late and soon.
I know the next
Wordsworth.
Yes?
It's the sonnet, getting and spending,
Spending
we
we
laid
laid
waste our powers.
Yes? That's good enough. Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away a sordid boon. It's miscellaneous sonnets by Wordsworth. The world is too much with us. Frank Muir. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me.
'Cause I'm off to Alabama with my banjo on my knee. I play the banjo better now. It's Stephen Makepeace Foster.
I wish it were. No, the accurate quotation is this. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I've come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. Do you remember where it was first sung?
In America.
2.5.
Oh.
It was first sung at Andrew's Eagle Ice Cream Saloon,
Of course it
1847, yes,
was, yeah.
in Pittsburgh. 2.5 marks, I think, after all there. And so the next round, which is origins and derivations of phrases, and these are expressions which are in fairly common use. I want to know what they mean and how they started. Dilys Powell. To ride roughshod over someone.
It means to be rather bullying to somebody
Yes,
and sort of crack down on what they say.
yes.
And it comes from taking a horse without any shoes on and riding it over somebody.
Not quite.
Is there anything to do with the horse?
Yes, oh yes, very
It
much
is.
so. Yes.
Well, not sort of not the right kind of shoes on.
Sort of pumps for
Yes.
days.
Stiletto heels.
Yes. No,
Ride roughshod.
no, it's not. It isn't like pumps. It's dance out more like climbing boots. The point is that a horse that is roughshod has the nail heads projecting through the shoe instead of sort of properly fined down,
Like cricket
so that
boots.
it's smooth. And any horse that walked, ran, or jumped over you, roughshod, meant that you were not only had the weight of the horse, but you had the projections of the nails too. That must have been very nasty indeed.
Very
I think
swell.
that's sick.
And figuratively, it means showing a callous lack of consideration for somebody else. 3 out of 4, I think. Denis Norden.
Hello.
To steal a march.
Well, that means to gain a kind of unexpected advantage
Yes.
over somebody.
And from?
Well, yes, it was at the time of the barons when the calendar was introduced, and they told the peasants, they took March completely out of the calendar, so the peasants believed there were only 11 months in the year, and they paid their taxes, instead of paying on the 1st of April, they paid them on the 28th of February. Thus, the barons had an unfair advantage, which went on right till the repeal of the Corn Laws and Lord Shaftesbury's Factories Act.
Give
Ride
us
roughshod.
back our 11
Yes.
months. No, it won't do. It's a jolly nice story, though, Dennis. It means now to take an advantage over somebody by cunning and take them by surprise by doing so. But it was in the days when it depended very much how you marched and how fast you marched. And an enemy might be lulled into false security by thinking you were 2 or 3 marches away. And if you did an unexpected march on him with your arm, you caught up with him or confronted him or got to the place he wanted to get to before him, before he expected it. And that was stealing a march, a stolen, unexpected march. Nancy Spain. What's the present day meaning of the term deadline, and how did it start?
Well, if you have to write a story by the day before yesterday, that is known as a deadline.
I don't want it good, I want it Tuesday.
Exactly that.
And
How did it start?
well, the thing is, once the line is passed, it's dead. It's
You don't
it's
know
like-
this, eh? It's the line or time nowadays beyond which you mustn't go in submitting a bit of work or making a contract or something like that. But originally it was a real deadline. It was in United States prisons, and the authorities used to paint a line across the exercise yards where the prisoners were exercising, and if you did cross that line, they shot you. They shot you dead. Simple as all that.
yeah.
All right, Frank Muir. What do you understand by the term log rolling?
It's vaguely political.
Yes?
Doesn't it mean that I'll go along with you with the understanding, the tacit understanding that you will eventually go along with me?
Yes, that's
all
it.
those things.
It is, yes. And how does it start?
Were they clearing?
Yes.
dogs? Yes. Well, I'll help you. Yes. The Pilgrim Fathers, New England.
Yes, that's it.
Wooded. Imagine, lots of woods. They had to build their cabins, but where could they build them? All these trees in the way. When you've got a next-door neighbour called the woods, and you can't see the woods for the trees, well, you have to cut the trees away, you see. And they say, you help me cut these trees away and roll them, and I'll help you. Hence this every day, every other day phrase, log rolling.
Absolutely right. Now we come to the last round, and we go back to those quotations I gave the two teams earlier on in the program. For 2 marks, Dilys, can you give me the origin of your quotation, which was, Britons never, never, never will be slaves?
Well, that's Rule Britannia.
By
Thompson.
Thompson. Quite right. 2 marks. Nancy Spain, I want the origin of your quotation, and that was, is your journey really necessary?
Well, this was on all those posters, Jack, from 1939, 40, 41, 42, and so on.
Yes?
And I suppose the origin was some happy advertising agent whose firm had been paid a large sum of money by the then government. And it was probably the decision was actually taken at one of those really awful board meetings where somebody says, now what are we going to put on these posters to stop them? Travelling,
Dig for victory.
And they waited, they couldn't think what to put on the poster, and one of those office boys came in with a white face and red hair, and they said, what would you say to these people if you didn't want them to travel? And the office boy said, is your journey really necessary?
And
Well, that's a beautiful and entrancing story. I'm going to give Nancy 2 marks for it. And now I ask Frank and Dennis to give me their explanations of how these quotations really came into being.
Right.
And on this occasion, no, wait a bit. This occasion, the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation
Well, let
receives
Frank tell
the
his
longer
story.
amount of applause from you, the audience, here in the studio.
now,
So,
Frank,
right.
go.
Britons never, never,
Go.
never will be slaves.
Go.
Britons never know. Right. I'm a fairly cosmopolitan sort of chap, you know. I'm very interested in other nations, and I trust other nations are very interested in me. But I worry sometimes, you know. And one of the things I worry about is whether this country of ours, Britain, Great Britain, Albion, isn't coming too much under the influence of other countries. Take the United States of America. Well, no, not literally, but just sort of examine them. You see, they have given us what? They've given us the automatic eating machine, the automat. Instead of having waitress service in a restaurant, the little flaps and things like a huge wardrobe that you approach with a tray and lifted things out. I went into one of those, terribly unnerving, and I put my tray down, and I got a piece of fish out of a cupboard thing, and I was reaching for the tomato sauce, and I unscrewed the tomato sauce from another cupboard, and I shook it vigorously, and it had shaken right over a lady's blancmange. Apparently this thing I put my tray down on was actually a moving platform. And my tray of fish was now about 8 feet long. And by the time I'd explained to the lady what my tomato sauce was doing on her de blanche, I then had to run up there. And I'd lost my tray entirely because there was a sort of right-angle bend in this arrangement. And I ended up with 4 lemon curd tarts, which I don't eat, and a handful of drinking straws, which I chewed rather miserably. And that was my experience of automatic. Now, what would we get from Italy? I mean, you've seen Italian films. They all talk with terrific gestures of the arms. Well, I was thinking about this, you know. This is what we'll be doing. You know where you talk most? At a cocktail party. Imagine everybody talking with great gestures of the arm, holding a glass of gin. This gin will be sluicing through the air. Cocktail parties in England would be like Brighton Front, midwinter in a force 8 gale, spewing gin, you know. And think of those cocktail sticks. You know, there's no sharper piece of wood in the world than a cocktail stick, loaded with a heavy cherry. It'll be King Harold at Hastings all over again. I am a very worried man. And then Yugoslavia. You see, the Yugoslavia hire purchase system. It's all run by the government, and if you pay for your television set in less than 2 years, you get a small brass medal. And if you take longer than 2 years, you get shot. You see, I don't think this is a good thing. You know, because if anybody should be shot in television, surely it shouldn't be the viewer, for one thing. And I think this would be a terribly bad thing. I mean, so much. I mean, Britain is a land of never, never now. And I mean, if you're going to get shot, if you get overpaid, well, life is going to be pretty crisp, isn't it? And I think it may do for the Slavs, but not for here. So I want you, after this program is over, to rise with me in a body, and we're all going to shout at the top of our voices, "Rule Britannia, although Britannia starves, Britons never, never, never shall be Slavs."
And so to Denis Norden, and his quotation was, "Is your journey really necessary?"
Old wartime saying. This takes me back to wartime. I was with the 31st Commando Ablutions and Maintenance Unit. We were a specially trained mob, 5 of us, actually. I was in charge because I was the only one who had a field dressing. And we were being trained to be dropped onto enemy territory, capture German generals, and bring them back. And we were given an extensive course of training, including manoeuvres and dummy exercises. And part of the training was to take a real general and try and run him across England without being spotted. For this purpose, they gave us this general, who was a foreign general. He was actually a retired French general. And we were given him at Catterick and told to get him down to Aldershot without being captured. And they alerted the whole of the home forces to be looking for us. Well, it was some job. They landed us in this field and they said, "Right, there's your general. We're going to count to 100 with our eyes closed, and then we're going to open them and come after you." So we ran like mad for 5 hours with this general, and then paused, because we saw that was no good. He was 82. I should have mentioned that. He was having tremendous difficulty keeping up. So I said, "All right, Frobisher, you take him by the arms. O'Malley, you take him by the legs, and we'll run with the General for a while." So we ran for 2.5 hours. Then I noticed that O'Malley hadn't heard my order. Frobisher had him by the legs. He was being taken across country rather like people sometimes pull a lawnmower. So we stopped again, and we picked the bits of bramble and earth off him. He was in fine spirits, kept on saying, "Ils ne passeront pas." And he had the wrong war or something, but he was a very keen old chap. And we thought, well, we'll never get him down to Aldershot at this rate. The thing to do is to get some transport. Put him in some transport. And evade capture, of course. So we put him in a hollow tree trunk and reconnoitred. And I saw a military hospital for Indian soldiers. As you know, we had quite a lot over here during the war. we thought, now if we can get some transport from here, we have a chance of getting our General down to Aldershot without being spotted. So I obtained an ambulance by a very clever subterfuge. I went to the CO of the camp and I said, I bet if I asked you for an ambulance you'd think it was a very clever subterfuge. He said, I bet I wouldn't. We went out with the ambulance, and inside we found 3 Indian medical orderlies' uniforms and a sari belonging to an Indian nurse. So we shared the medical orderlies' uniforms among us, and we dressed the General in a sari. And he looked terribly good. He looked just like something from The Rains Came. You know, he like a very beautiful Indian nurse, if you sort of shut your eyes, half closed, you know, which you have to do in the Indian sun, so that's all right. And we put him in the ambulance, and it very nearly came off. We travelled a full, 430 yards, I think it was, before we were intercepted by a roadblock which the CO of the hospital had put up, because he'd been thinking about this subterfuge and decided it was a subterfuge. And we were interrogated, taken to the interrogation room, and he was taken off by a rather burly ATS officer, the General in the sari. We were a little bit worried because she was bound to investigate to one extent or another, and we sat there crouched there, and finally we got this message from the head of the interrogation department which said, is your journey really necessary? And we thought we'd got away with it until O'Malley, who was very quick at these things, said, no, we haven't got away with it, read it again. Actually what it did read was, is your General in nurse's sari?
Well, I don't know. I find that rather hard to decide. I think by a short round, as it were, Frank Muir just wins. And that brings us to a final score in which Frank Muir and Dilys Powell win by 2 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden. It also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And here's round 1, which tries to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if you can give me the meaning of the following words, approximately right. Nancy Spain, the word is gustation, G-U-S-T-A-T-I-O-N, gustation.
Tasting
Yep.
with joy or gusto.
Or gusto, yes. Latin gustus, taste. 2 marks. Frank Muir, and this is much harder. The meaning of the word fatidical, F-A-T-I-D-I-C-A-L, fatidical.
Fatidical.
Yes?
Fatidical. Well, Susanna was a funniful man. Idly down. And somebody like Jimmy Edwards is a fatidical man. Am I warm?
No.
Can't read your writing.
I'm prophesying, try.
We've been in solemn conclave
Yeah.
here, and we've come to the conclusion that it's prophesying.
It's quite right. It's somebody who's gifted with prophetic powers. And Jimmy Edwards may be, but that's not usually what he claims. All right, you creep home to 2 marks.
Greek.
Dilys Powell, what is a dooley? D-O-O-L-I-E. Dooley.
Dooley. It's Indian.
It's Indian.
It's Indian. It's a bed, litter.
Yes, that'll do. It's a litter.
A
Very
litter will
simple
do.
kind of litter or stretcher used in India for carrying the sick after battles or motor accidents or what have you. 2 marks.
It's immortalized in that I sent a litter to my love.
Dilly dooley something, yes. Denis Norden, what is purse? P-E-R-S-E.
P-E-R-S-E.
That's it.
It's short for Persian, I think.
Don't think so.
But you're not sure, are you? And I do think that I should be given the benefit of any reasonable doubt.
If you creep home towards the meaning, I might.
P-E-R-S-E.
That's it.
I can't make any kind of sousing out of this one at all.
No. It's a difficult one. It's a colour, bluish grey, like sort of gules is red, and purse is bluish grey. Why you should be, I'm not very clear. Well, then we go on to round 2, and before we start that, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and then at the end I ask them where those quotations come from. And Nancy Spain and Denis, your quotation is, "There are fairies at the bottom of our garden." And Dilys Powell with Frank Muir, yours is, "If you have tears, prepare to shed them now." And then at the end of the programme I ask Denis and Frank to give me their idea of how these words came to be said or written. And I don't want any of these answers now. And so, round 2. Of whom and by whom were the following lines said or written? 2 marks if you get it right. Nancy Spain. "With our James, vulgarity begins at home and should be allowed to stay there."
With our James?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody royal, no.
Nobody royal, no.
No, nothing of that
Bit
sort.
transatlantic.
Oh, yes. Well, Oscar is saying it
Yes.
as usual
Yes.
about James McNeill Whistler.
Ah, I gave you almost too much of a clue there.
I think you did. Well, what he said was transatlantic
Yes, that's all I did.
or transatlantic.
It is. It's Oscar Wilde speaking about the painter Whistler in a letter to a magazine called The World. Frank Muir. "Why, sir, he is dull, naturally dull, but it must have taken a great deal of pains to become what we now see him. Such an excess of stupidity, sir, is not in nature."
Well, with so many sirs, it's Dr. Johnson for a ducat.
Yes, you're quite right there.
But as he loathes so many people, it's rather difficult to pinpoint who he's talking about. No, I won't. Look,
All
Jack,
right,
I don't want to waste your time.
1 out of 2. Dr. Johnson was speaking, but he was speaking of the Irish playwright Robert Brinsley Sheridan.
Oh, yes.
Dilys Powell. "The conformation of his mind was such that whatever was little seemed to him great, and whatever was great seemed to him little."
Macaulay.
Macaulay it was. I think you better stick at that point, because I think unlikely you'll know who he was talking about.
No,
So
I
that-
don't think.
1 out of 2, I think. Lord Macaulay talking about Horace Walpole. Denis Norden. "He speaks to me as if I was a public meeting."
Oh, yes, this is the Queen Victoria
Yes.
of Gladstone, the one she
Yes,
didn't like.
quite right. It comes from W. E. Russell's Collections and Recollections, and it's attributed to Queen Victoria, talking about Gladstone, whom she didn't very much love. Well, in the next round, origins and derivations. These are words and expressions which are pretty familiar. I want to know what they mean now and how they originated. Beginning with Nancy Spain. "Act of grace."
An act of grace?
Yes.
Well, I suppose you're doing something which is helpful,
Yes,
friendly, helpful, kind,
yes.
like the Boy Scouts or the Forest Rangers. And it derived from, grass adieu and all that bit. The old Norman conquest saying.
No, it's a lot later than that. I think 1.5 out of 4, because it's an act of forgiveness or pardon, usually from a sort of higher in the social register to someone a little lower down the social register. Hence,
Noblesse oblige.
yeah, it's more like that than anything. But it was originally an act of Parliament, the one that gave general formal pardon when William III came over and pardoned political offenders who'd been on the other side, and then again after the 1745 Jacobite rebellion, when the estates which were forfeited by the Jacobites then were given back about 40 years later. So it was an actual act. All right, Frank Muir. Days of Grace.
Oh, it's the period that Princess Rainier has been at Monaco.
Won't do.
It's also a sort of interim period. And a few days' grace is a little bit of leeway for meeting a date in repayment of debts, Jack.
Yes, extra time given to settle a debt or to complete a contract more than you bargained for, and it is a strictly commercial term, and it meant 3 extra days before you had to pay a bill of exchange or a commercial bill. Dilys Powell, the word paraphernalia.
What it means now, it
Yes.
means a sort of lot of extra decorations and impedmentas.
It's like
Jack.
bacchanalia, only you get
Yes.
drunk on paraffin.
Name is red.
I've not been helped very much, I think, so far.
Well, I don't
A general sort of fighting towards the meaning, I think that is, Dilys.
Paraphernalia means a lot of extra baggage. And
Yes,
extra baggage.
that'll do. Not quite right, but near enough. And it meant originally what?
Para, something on the side.
Yes?
Alia means nothing except alia.
No,
It's
it's
that
just
fern I
both.
don't get.
I think it's not Greek or Latin. This
It
time.
is both. Sorry.
Can't get more erudite than that.
Articles of clothing, ornaments, general accessories, odds and ends, appurtenances in general. That's the present meaning. But originally it was those articles of personal wearing apparel and adornment that the law allowed a married woman to keep and treat as her own, especially after her husband died. And in Roman law, it usually included her bedroom furniture, her clothes, and her jewels. And that's what it meant. And phony is Greek for da. Denis Norden, robot.
Well, it's a mechanical type man,
Yes?
made of tin. 2 big round red lights up there and a kind of thermostat thing on his chest.
I thought that was a phylactery.
Yeah. And he walks sort of clonk, clonk, clonk.
Yes? And originally?
Well, now, didn't this come from RUR?
Yes,
Somebody's Universal Robots.
that's it. Do you remember who wrote it?
Carol, and it's C with a thing on top,
Yes.
Apec.
Yes,
So
that's
I don't know whether it's Chapek or Apec or Capek.
Which was a play about...
Play about robots.
Yeah? Well done, Dennis.
I'm no fool.
Four clear marks. It's a mechanical man or a similar contrivance built to do manual and mental work for lazy human beings, like a robot pilot. But it's usually said that it came from this play, RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, by Karol Čapek, I think it is, isn't it? Czech dramatist. And the mechanical men eventually revolted and destroyed their human masters. But in fact, it's much earlier than that. It is a Slav word meaning work, and it was applied by the Empress Maria Theresa in the 18th century, a robot patenta, which is a charter limiting the amount of work that feudal lords could exact from their unfortunate serfs. So it isn't invented by Čapek.
And the human beings they destroyed were called cancelled checks.
Well, the next round is the who, why, and what department. The 2 marks, what can you tell me about the following? And Nancy Spain, what was a harpy? H-A-R-P-Y.
It was one of those unfortunate ladies in Greek mythology that had bronze claws and brass what's-the-names and and iron wings.
Yes.
And with twain she did fly. You know, and all that.
I thought...
Different sauce, but
They were very nasty. They ate up
Yes.
and was practically like a Valkyrie, really, only earlier in the Greek time.
much dirtier.
Dirtier, yes, much.
Mhm.
And they crouched in a cave, and when they weren't doing that, they were whizzing about.
I think that's a pretty succinct description of what they were.
Well, they had claws, wings.
Yes.
Otherwise
pair of
women.
pants, yeah.
You
Yes,
know.
otherwise women.
Pair of
Yes.
pants, waistcoat. I thought a harpy was air raid precaution.
And one of the watches.
Nancy's quite right, yes, they were. Winged women, very nasty, very loathsome. They carried off the picnic. When poor Odysseus was lunching on the beach, these people came along and flew around him and took away all the picnic. And they also were instruments of divine vengeance. They usually appeared in the middle of a storm. And nowadays, a grasping, vicious woman,
That's right.
roughly. 2. Frank Muir, what is or was a clerk? C-L-A-Q-U-E.
Clack.
What if you like, clack or clerk?
The clack was a splendid institution we should see more of in this country. I think it was invented by a Frenchman for opera,
Yes.
wasn't it? It was a paid section of the audience who were paid to laugh and cry bravo and clap like steam, and they were paid usually by the soprano, who then had a riotous reception and tremendously good press. And
Yes, you're quite right. Monsieur Sauton started this idea in 1820. He actually kept an office for it so that he would supply to theatrical managers helpers of various kinds. There were commissaires who committed the play to memory and then loudly discussed it and its merits. There were rieurs who laughed uproariously at all the jokes, even the bad ones. There were pleureurs, who were women who would weep at suitable points in the play. And finally, bisseurs, whose job was to applaud and cry bis, 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 which means encore, encore. Highly organized profession.
Isn't it funny how the French have never learnt the right word for encore?
2 marks. Dilys Powell, who are Eugene Marchbanks and Parson Morell?
A play by Shaw
Yes, quite right.
called Candida.
Candida, quite right. And who are these characters?
Mr. Marchbanks is the young gentleman who's making love
Yes,
to Candida.
yes. And Morell?
I think he must be a husband.
Yes, husband he is.
Her husband.
Quite right. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw's Candida, and Candida was the wife of Morell, who was a hackney parson, whatever that may mean, and Marchbanks was a poet who made advances to her, who had a higher but vaguer, timider vision, rather ridiculous, unpractical type. 2 marks, well done, Dilys. Denis Norden, who was Bluebeard?
Was he actually Gilles de Rais?
That's one theory, yes.
Well, that's my theory. Now, he had several wives, and he had a locked room. And he used to kill his wives one by one if they entered the locked room. I don't know if there's anything else I can fill in about him, actually.
Do you remember who wrote the story down the first time?
What
I
was
don't
it?
know.
Pete,
No.
the
Perrault.
Frenchman.
Perrault, quite
Perrault.
right. 2 marks, that's right. It was
P-E-R-R-A-U-T.
invented, probably, this character. It may have been based on people like Gilles de Rais, by Charles Perrault, who was a fairy tale writer. And he did his wives in and locked them away in a room. And I think in the normal version, Dennis, the last wife of all, Fatima, got the key of the room and looked in and found all her predecessors hanging up, looking extremely dead. One of these charming French fairy tales. 2 marks. And that brings us to the last round, in which we go back to the quotations I gave the 2 teams earlier on the programme. Now, for 2 marks, Nancy Spain, I'd like the origin of your quotation. There are fairies at the bottom of our garden.
Well, it's a poem by Rose Fileman.
Yeah. It's
You don't want the whole poem.
No, I don't really, please. A poem called Fairies by Rose
Rose
Fileman. 2 marks. And Dilys Powell, the origin of your quotation, which was, if you have tears, prepare to shed them now.
That's from Julius Caesar
Yes?
by William Shakespeare, and it is spoken by Mark Antony over the body of Julius Caesar.
2 marks it is. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar,
7.
Mark Antony's funeral speech to the mob. And now I ask Denis and Frank to give me their explanations of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation receives the larger amount of applause from you, the audience here in the studio. So back to Denis Norden. There are fairies at the bottom of our garden.
Well, there are. Indirectly, it was why we bought the house. We saw this advertisement in the paper, in the houses for sale column, which said, midden detached hus for bids to recip all mod cons F at B of G. We'd never seen that in advertisement before, and you know it was intriguing. It made it look different from the other houses that were advertised, and we couldn't think what it meant. And anyway, we went along, and there was this dear old lady who explained to us that it actually meant fairies, that there were fairies at the bottom of the garden. Apparently, it had always been there since she was there. I got the house, and I had and have had ever since fairies at the bottom of our garden. Have you ever had them? It's rather interesting, actually. What they're supposed to do is they make the garden grow wild and sweet and enchanted, which is fine, except I get hay fever from flowers, and grass and shrubs bring on my sinus trouble. So the first summer we were there, I used 12 gross dozen of those paper handkerchiefs. Also, what the fairies do is they use the garden at night, from midnight on, as a kind of palais. They have these fairy rings where they dance and they play these little pipes and fill the air with little tinkling laughter. Now, I'm a terribly light sleeper, and our bedroom overlooks the garden, and by about August, I was tottering with fatigue. And in fact, it got so bad, I used to go at weekends to sleep at my mother's place. Of course, that causes a lot of talk among your friends. Dennis has gone back to his mother again. Then the winter was all right. The first winter was all right because they sort of hibernate or something during the winter. They disappear during the winter, and I had these few months to sort of get some sleep again, build up my strength. The twitching stopped slightly, you know. But the first warm day of spring, I threw open the bedroom window, and there, wafted up to me, was the scented air of flowers pushing their way through the ground in nature's perennial miracle. I sneezed for 35 minutes solid, and I thought, it's not on, you know, it just is not on. So I said to my wife, have the garden concreted, which we did. Well, the first few nights after we concreted the garden, they still came out and danced, but it was very half-heartedly. One could see that, you know, because when your shoes are soled with thistledown, dancing on concrete is no fun. You know, they raised a lot of little fairy blisters and so on, and that gradually tailed off, and all we heard in the evenings after that, instead of this tinkling, there was a lot of sort of muttering. And I remember Midsummer's evening, I opened the window and looked out. You know what they were doing, the fairies? Sitting around playing cards. And that's about it. That's about the story. Of course, they had nothing to do. They still hang around because they don't leave a place, and they're a bit narked. They keep casting these tiny spells, you know, over us. And everybody says that I've offended the fairies because I don't believe in them, which isn't true. I do believe in them, and I know exactly why they are narked. They are furious at the boredom of our garden.
Considering what fairies can do, I think Dennis got away very lightly. Now, Frank Muir, your quotation was, "If you have tears, prepare to shed them now."
Well, this has got to be a bit brief, I'm afraid, Jack. I want to dash away because I've got my car outside and I've got a neighbour of ours, a Mrs. Cope Willoughby, in the car. She's lying face downwards on the back seat. And she's been there since Thursday because I can't find a lady chemist. But to get to the story, last Thursday, actually, my boy was home from school, and he decided to do Julius Caesar for us in the garden in the open air. And he built what he called a comfy theatre. You have a sort of acting area, and then you have one row of seats, which is on beer crates. Actually, it's a plank across two beer crates. And then there was another row of seats, which was a plank across two creosote barrels. And then there was a third row of seats, this comfy theatre, which was a plank between two rather rickety step ladders. And he charged threepence for the first plank, and twopence for the second plank, and a penny for the top plank, you see. And Jim Hudson, who lives next door, is 6'3", and although he's terribly thin on top, I mean, that was all the trouble. I mean, obviously it was going to happen. I've left something out, haven't I? Well, what happened was, you see, they were going to play Julius Caesar, and we all had to go, and my son Jamie was Julius Caesar, and he looked terribly like Julius Caesar. He had his head thrust up through an old sheet, and he was carrying an antique horse pistol, and he'd stuck some rather dead laurel leaves round his forehead with that transparent cellulose tape, and he had a large plastic sign advertising petrol pinned to the sheet. And he was Julius Caesar, and our little poodle puppy Puddle was going to be. They wanted to be Mark Antony because he'd mark any sort of thing. But, we had to give it to Robert, who lives next door, because afterwards they're going to play cricket and it's his bat. So Robert was actually Mark Antony. And then up the drive came this neighbour of ours, Mrs. Cope Willoughby. And as we were in the middle of the play, I made her pay twopence, and she sat beside me on the middle plank, which was on the creosote barrels, you see. And she had a good view, and she said, "How nice to see the children playing," you see. Now, the children were gabbling a bit. When Jim Hudson, this chap who's 6'3", although he's going thin on top, he had to come in. And he, because his son was Mark Antony, had to pay threepence and sit on the front bench, you see. So Mrs. Cope Willoughby couldn't see properly, and she slid along this plank. Now, deal planks, you know, are curious things, and if you leave them out in the rain, the grain sort of swells and splinters lift. Now, the comfy theatre faced north in order that the spectators should get the sun, so the seats, which were these wooden tiers, were facing east and west, were running east and west. All I can say is Mrs. Cope Willoughby slid east, and there was a splinter pointing west. Of course, the whole thing was terribly tragic, and she's a very sensitive woman, and ever since Thursday I've had her in the back of the car, face downwards, where I'm trying to find a lady chemist who can take the splinter out. But I would like to warn parents who have children who might be putting Julius Caesar on in a comfy theatre that don't let your guests suffer the fate of Mrs. Cope Willoughby. Do watch this business, because if you have these wooden tiers of seats and you leave them out in the sun, they will get splinters in them. So chuck them in the shed right away, and don't wait until the weather forecast says rain. If you have tears, prepare to shed them now.
I didn't think that could be played straight, but it was. And I think by your applause, Frank Muir just wins. And that brings us to a final score, which is very close indeed, in which Nancy Spain and Denis Norden win by 1 mark from Frank Muir and Dilys Powell. And it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir, and Denis Norden. And here's round 1 to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they can give me the meaning of these words more or less right. Beginning with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is a spurrier? Or some pedants call it spurrier. S-P-U-R-R-I-E-R, spurrier.
Spurrier, I like better.
Do you?
Yes, spurrier. It must be connected with spurs.
And what do
He
you do?
make them. He makes them.
That's right. Rather than wearing them, he makes them. A maker of spurs. 2 marks, well done. Denis Norden, what is a trauma? T-R-A-U-M-A.
Well, a traumatic or traumatic experience is an experience that leaves an impression on your soul forevermore.
Yes.
Like putting a bare foot on a wet boxing glove. Have you ever done that? In the dark.
Not in your soul, that is.
Well, Jack, there are 2 schools of thought about that. If you mean it affects you emotionally and
Yes.
thus affects you physically.
Yes. All right, that'll do. The original surgical meaning is a condition of the body produced by a wound, but it's more often used for an emotional shock, as Denis says. 2 marks. Nancy Spain, what is diablerie? D-I-A-B-L-E-R-I-E, diablerie.
Devilish practicing.
Yes, as such.
As such, indeed.
Let's have an example.
Necromancy.
Yes, that'll do.
Yeah.
Sorcery, devil's law,
Sorcery.
wild
Fortune
recklessness.
telling. Bob's your uncle.
That's all.
And bingo.
Everything except bingo. That's very respectable. Mothers' unions have it. 2 marks. Frank, what is a rotunda? R-O-T-U-N-D-A.
It's an elephant. Rotunda. It's the bottom of a letter. It's a P.S. Rotunda is a round thing.
Yes.
Like an elephant. Only it's
Rounder than that.
This is completely round. It's
Yes.
a round building
Yes.
with a round thing on top,
Yes.
and you can run round it.
Because what's the round thing on top called?
It's called the roof. It's a cupola. If there were 2 of them, they're called cupola.
2 marks and I give up. Building of circular ground plan, mostly with a dome. We have the largest in the world in Derbyshire. It's called Devonshire Hospital. Now, before we start round 2, I'm going to give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and then at the end of the program, I shall ask them where they come from. And Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, your quotation is, always take mother's advice. And Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, yours is, it's naughty, but it's nice. And then at the end of the program, I asked Frank and Denis to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers now. And so to round 2. I want to know what were being described by the writers and poets concerned when they wrote the following. 2 marks for a correct answer, and an extra mark if you can name the author. Dilys Powell, it comprehends our whole life, for we were born in it, we live in it, and we shall die in it.
A rotunda.
Well, jolly lucky if that's true, but I don't think it is.
We were born in it.
And we shall die in it.
Die in it. Bed.
Yes?
I thought it was
A bed.
It's a
poverty.
bed.
It's a bed.
And do you know who was saying this
Who's
great saying?
He said it a long time ago. Didn't he?
He might have done. Never, it was said a very long time ago.
Yeah, something like Montaigne or something like that.
Yes, it's not a bad shot. I don't think you're going to get it.
No?
2 out of 3. It's Guy de Maupassant.
Oh, nice.
But it was said very much earlier, or roughly the gist of it, by a chap called Isaac de Benzerade, translated by Dr. Johnson.
Oh, naturally.
Yeah, that was a good deal earlier.
Of course.
All right, Denis Norden. When all things were made, none was made better than this, to be a lone man's companion, a bachelor's friend, a hungry man's food, a sad man's cordial, a wakeful man's sleep, and a chilly man's fire.
Well, that could be any one of a dozen girls, really. It's either drink.
No.
Good. Elimination. It's some vice. Smoking?
Yes?
Smoking.
Well, not quite smoking, but the thing itself.
Tobacco.
Yes, tobacco. It is, tobacco. Now, do you remember who said it?
Who said it, Nancy?
I don't know. Sir James Barry had a big thing about
He had a
Mary
big thing
Nicholson.
about, yeah.
No, it
It
wasn't,
wasn't he, though.
No.
No, somebody
It's a Walter
early.
Raleigh then,
Sounds like
maybe.
early because I bet that's
Little
lots
earlier.
of commas in it, aren't there? So it must be.
There's a
very
lot of
early.
commas.
No,
2 out of
quite
3.
frank, I don't know.
2 out of 3. It's Kingsley. It's Salvation Yeo talking in Westward Ho. Well, Nancy Spain, here is yours. When all is said, what is it? A rosy dot placed on the eye in loving. 'Tis a secret told to the mouth instead of the ear.
Oh, I have seen it written down. There's a thing.
Well, Nancy's seen it written down, Jack.
Yes.
Give her.
I think for good observation.
No, it's no good. I've got it written down. No marks. It describes a kiss, and it comes in Cyrano de Bergerac from Edmond Rostand. There we are. You did see it probably, Nancy, but a long time ago.
Oh, I'm mistaken.
Oh,
I didn't,
oh
obviously.
sorry.
Somebody in the audience knew the quotation.
That's jolly good. Well, we'll swap the tea.
She's taking a degree in kissing, I think.
All right, back to Frank Muir. There is a certain race of men that either imagine it their duty or make it their amusement to hinder the reception of every work of learning or genius, who stand as sentinels in the avenues of fame and value themselves upon giving ignorance and envy the first notice of a prey.
It's somebody who wrote something
Yes,
and had something nasty said by somebody.
that's it, yes.
But who wrote the original thing and who wrote about
Well,
the chap who wrote
what's
the
he
original-
writing about? That's the first thing.
He's writing about the sort of chap who would write that sort of thing about the sort of thing he wrote.
Yes, it has a name for
The
it.
critics.
Yes, it's written about critics, that's all right. And who do you think wrote it? One of our old favourites, sir.
One of my old favourites.
Sir.
Marilyn Monroe.
I've helped you as much as I can. 2 out of 3.
Johnson.
Dr. Johnson, too late. 2 out of 3. All right, to the next round, which is origins and derivations. And these are words and expressions which are in fairly common use. I want to know what they mean and how they originated. Beginning with Dilys Powell, the phrase down to bedrock or bedrock.
Something to do with mining.
Yes?
Getting down to the bottom of the mine.
Gone about as
Can't
far
get any
as they can
further.
go.
Yes.
Yes, not quite right. I give a mark for that. It
That's,
isn't quite what I want. Normally it means down to your last bit of money, more or less broke now, or it's the ultimate principles or ultimate principles of a character or a theory, right down to bedrock. And it comes from coal mining mainly. Got down to bedrock means the coal seam is exhausted and you're down to the hard basic rock and there's no more coal in the seam. Denis Norden, a rift in the lute.
Well, it means a disturbance in a harmonious relationship.
Yes. And what happens after that?
What happens after that? Oh, no one shoots each other. Or
Yes, all right, that's what I want. It goes much further than you want. And what it come from?
Well, it came from a lute. So,
What have you done with your lute, Dennis?
well, you rifted it, obviously. Lute is a kind of a stringed instrument. And if you've got a rift in it, well, it's like a tennis racket which gets a warp in it, you know. All the strings go funny.
Won't go woof.
And you keep saying, sorry, partner, and so on. And when you get a rift in the lute between two people, you keep saying, sorry, partner.
Yes, that's it. Yes, all right, I think that's good enough.
You can't play French cricket with a bent lute.
Yes, Dennis is quite right, 4 marks. A small disagreement, which nevertheless ends by spoiling everything. The thing goes completely to pieces afterwards. And it was a thing like a guitar or a mandolin. And if you got a crack in it, then you didn't produce any music, and it got worse and worse, and finally split. Nancy Spain, to put a spoke in someone's wheel.
It means to upset everything, absolutely, Jack. Like the rift in the lute, you know. In fact, it's another way of putting it would be to throw a spanner in the works.
Yes, that's good enough. And it comes from what?
Let us go back, Jack,
Yes.
to the prehistoric days.
That's it.
Yes, indeed.
They had square wheels. You put a spoke in those.
Flintstone wheels. Well, if you put a spoke in a square wheel, it would be bad.
Spoke through a wheel. That's
Yes,
Yes.
that's it. Yes.
That's, I think, good enough. 2.5 out of 4. It means nowadays to thwart somebody's ambitions or impede their progress deliberately. And originally this comes from a time when wheels hadn't got spokes in the normal sense at all. They were made of solid wood and they had 3 holes in them. And if a driver was going down a steep hill and was afraid that his cart would catch up his horse, he put a spoke or bar through one of these holes in his solid wheel, and that meant it didn't turn any longer, it acted as a brake. Frank Muir, the horn of plenty.
Oh, it means, oh, absolutely splendid, lashings of everything. It came from, oh, it's classical, Jack.
Yes?
And it was a magic horn. And the idea was that all those huge grapes and pears and things which were falling out, you took them out, and miraculously others appeared.
Yes?
So you could have grapes, big hothouse grapes and pears, as much as you like, because there's always more in the cornucopia.
As Denis Norden once said, without having any sickness in the house. If I remember. I think that's 4 marks, all right. Overflowing plenty, more than you could possibly want. And it comes, as Frank Muir rightly says, from classical legend. The infant Zeus, the god, was fed by Amalthea, one of the daughters of the king of Crete, fed on goat's milk. And Zeus, being a tough and at the same time grateful infant, broke off one of the goat's horns and presented it to her and said it would always be full of all sorts of plenty, like the grapes that Frank Muir has mentioned. And that's the horn of plenty, Amalthea's horn. Well, the next round is the who, what, and why department. 2 marks if you can tell me about the following. Dilys Powell, what are the sinews of war?
Well, that's metaphorical, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yes? It doesn't mean tough men, no.
No, and it doesn't mean something like cannon or no.
Well, Dilys, it can, but that's
It can mean
a secondary
cannon.
meaning, and I want the normal meaning.
Well, it's the thing which provides the cannon,
Yes, that's no it.
not the transport. The money.
Absolutely right. It's the essential funds without which you can't carry on a war, anyway, more than a day or two, and first mentioned by Cicero and by lots of other people as well. Denis Norden, who was Torquemada?
Torquemada was in the Spanish Inquisition. He was a sort of chief arm twister.
Yes. That's an absolutely accurate description. He was the first Inquisitor General of the Spanish Inquisition, and his name became a byword for cruelty and torture.
I thought it became a crossword.
Yes, he's never a crossword. Yes, I agree. In fact, this is a little unfair because he was a relatively moderate inquisitor, and most of the cruelties were perpetrated by people who followed on from him. 2 out of 2. Nancy Spain. Who was Dandy Dinmont?
Well, it's a dog, little blue dog.
Yes.
Well, he was a man who kept this breed of dogs,
Yes.
and he worked it all out, and he had them crossbreeding and breeding.
Yes.
back
But
and
where did he
forth.
originally occur?
County Durham.
No. It's a nice thought. 1 out of 2. He was a farmer in Walter Scott's novel Guy Mannering, who owned a special breed of terriers, and Scott explains in one of his tiresome footnotes that the character wasn't based on a real man, but was nearest to a chap called James Davidson, who lived at Hindley, I think across the border, who was similar in appearance to the description he'd given, and who did breed a special breed of terriers, which he called mustard or pepper, but who were afterwards called Dandy Dinmonts. Frank Muir. Who was Joseph Pulitzer, or Pulitzer?
He's chiefly known to me as the initiator of the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
It is
Which is
given-
awarded for what?
awarded for journalism,
Yes.
for big news story of the year.
And he himself was?
Rich.
Yes.
An American.
$14,500 a year, I think, is the prize money. He was a journalist. He was one of the chief founders of sensational journalism in America, and his claim was that he did it in order to expose corruption and to level out social inequalities. But he's quite right. Frank did say that he was responsible, through his will, for the Pulitzer Prize for letters, music, and good newspaper work. And now we come to the last round and go back to the quotations I gave the 2 teams earlier in the programme. And for 2 marks, Dilys Powell, can you give me the origin of your quotation, which was, always take mother's advice?
No, it's a nursery rhyme. Always take.
It's a rhyme.
It's a rhyme. Old song.
Yes. All right, 1 mark out of 2 for saying it's an old song, which is correct. It's by Jenny Lindsay, who was an American songwriter in the late 19th century. Always take mother's advice. She knows what is best for your good. Let her kind words then suffice. And always take mother's advice. She rather ran out of rhymes. Now, Nancy Spain, I like the origin of your quotation, and that was, it's naughty, but it's nice.
And isn't anything to do with mother's advice.
No. Always take father's advice. It's naughty, but it's nice.
Something to do with the gypsies in the wood. It's another old song.
Yes. All right, 1 out of 2. I think that's fair because I gave Dilys the same. No, first of all, it comes in a novel by Ouida, I never know how to pronounce her name, called The Moth. She knew how to be so naughty and so nice in the way that society in London likes and never punishes. And then it became an English music hall song in about 1875. Some say it's naughty, but it's really very nice. And afterwards it was a Victorian catchphrase in its present form. It's naughty, but it's nice. Complicated origin. 1 out of 2. And now I'm going to ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanations of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation receives the greater amount of applause from you, the studio audience. So back to Frank Muir with his quotation, always take mother's advice.
Just remembering the time I did take my mother's advice, actually. If I may go on a short safari down memory lane. Take me back to the other day I had a letter from a very old friend of mine called Harris. And the last time I saw Harris, our hearts were young and gay, because we were both very young, and we were at the seaside, Broadstairs, and I was 14 at the time, a strange, moody lad, reticent. I was just going through adolescence, actually, and I was sensitive. I was at that time 14 and 6'5" high, and exactly 7 inches wide all the way down. I was a boy full of love. My heart abounded with love, and I had there was a girl I used to sort of fight on the beach, called Gwen. I realised I'd fallen in love with Gwen, and this was a very, very awkward time indeed. I was almost over my spots, and I'm nearly over them now completely. But I started going off my food, and I could only manage about 9 helpings of suet pudding. But my whole vision matured. Gwen was a largish girl, rather nice. The only thing about her was her voice, which was one of those terribly brittle voices, and she used to shriek across the beach, "Hello, Frank!" like that, and the glass in the bandstand clock would rattle at 100 yards, and this sort of hard tone used to grate on me. But I dearly loved her. She was a very sweet girl. And then I met Maud. And Maud was entirely different. Maud was very long and thin, and she had the sort of hair you only seem to find on shrunken heads. It's sort of very long, parted in the middle, and hangs down either side of the face to the waist, leaving a sort of white isosceles triangle face. And she was a terribly sweet girl, but rather dim. She was a bit short on conversation, and I dearly wanted to marry one of these girls, and I had 25 and 8 saved at the time. And, I thought it'd probably be a good idea, but I couldn't make up my mind which one to have. So I asked my mother's advice. And my mother said, "I'll tell you a story." You see, my mother said when George Washington was about 42, he wanted to get married. He was a rising young politician with a house called Mount Vernon, and he loved a middle-aged widow called Martha. But Martha also had a harsh, grating voice. But George Washington married his Martha, and her voice was so hard that he never stayed in Mount Vernon. He couldn't bear the sound of it. He worked very hard and became President of the United States, and had, as you know, a town named after him, Georgetown. And so my mother said, if you ever have to decide between 2 girls, always take the girl with the voice, even though the other one's nicer, and you'll end up like George Washington. So if you have to choose between two of these girls, well, always take Martha's hard voice.
And now back to Denis Norden, and his phrase, if you remember, was, "It's naughty, but it's nice."
Not very long ago, about a year or so, I took an office and set myself up as a business consultant. One of my very first clients was a man who came to me, and he said he had a very small manufacturing plant and he wanted to go into the export trade. And I said, "Well, what do you manufacture?" Which was pretty shrewd. And he said, "Ice cream." Now that really set my imagination going, because, as you know, Britain is doing very well in the export market at the moment with motor cars and steel and precision instruments, but we are lagging behind in the field of ice cream. Now you can go abroad, you rich people who go abroad for your holidays, you go to Italy, to France, go to Paris, you will very rarely be offered an English ice cream. And when you come to think of it, ice cream has made very great strides in the post-war economic years, not only in package and design, but also they made great strides in the field of flavour. So I said to this man, let us concentrate on new flavours for ice cream and we can enter the world market. So he said, what new flavours? So I said, well, apple-flavoured ice cream. Nobody's done that. Or grape-flavoured ice cream with pips in. And his eyes began to shine. And I said, or why should ice cream flavours always be only fruit? There are other flavours. Why can't we make, for example, veal-flavoured ice cream? Or for children, for growing children, spinach-flavoured ice cream? Well, we showed great inventiveness and flair. Our imagination knew no bounds. We explored the whole spectrum of flavour. And these gradually became more and more well known until finally we received the accolade we knew we had been recognized by our European competitors. We received an invitation to exhibit our product at the Milan International Ice Cream Fair. Well, we were terribly excited about this, and this ice cream manufacturer, whose name was Earwicker, actually, he came to me and he said, "What shall we do?" I said, "Well, this time we must excel ourselves for the fair. It's going to be in Italy. Let us show them that we can give the customer exactly what he wants for his own particular needs. We'll make spaghetti ice cream." Fair enough. So we flew over to Milan, our own freezer. We got there. We bought the best spaghetti we could, and we stood by there and waited for tasting day. Tasting day was the day in which 5 international judges tasted all the various ice creams that were submitted to the fair and pronounced judgment on them. And on the morning of tasting day, Mr. Earwicker came to me with our little pots of spaghetti ice cream. He said, "Look, you taste it just to make sure it's all right, because I've never eaten spaghetti." And so I took a taste, and as I swallowed it, my heart dropped. I knew we'd been got at. I said, "Tell me, what did you do with the spaghetti that you bought to put in this?" He said, "I kept it in the hotel room." I said, "In the hotel room, unprotected?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "We've been got at. Our competitors have got in, and for the spaghetti they have exchanged bits of string." He said, "Impossible." I said, "Taste it." And with the little plastic spoon I fished out a little knotted, tangled piece of string from the ice cream. We had made string ice cream. He said, "We're ruined." I said, no, we're not ruined. Now let the British spirit of adventure really show itself. We shall exhibit this." So he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It is our claim that we can make ice cream out of anything." Well, if we can make ice cream out of anything, it might as well be string. It might as well. And that is what we did. We entered as our exhibit string ice cream. And the judges were captivated by the idea, by the courage of the idea. In fact, the judge tasted it, smacked his lips, and he said, "It's naughty, but it's a nice."
Wanted to know how he did so well at these international exhibitions, and now I do. And I think by your applause, Denis Norden wins with that story. And that brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir win by 5.5 marks from Denis Norden and Nancy Spain, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC.